Learn from the world's best all in one place with Masterclass, the only streaming platform where you can learn and grow with over 200 of the world's best. Masterclass always has great offers during the holidays, sometimes up to as much as 50% off. Head over to masterclass.com/Spotify for the current offer. That's up to 50% off at masterclass.com/Spotify.
Ryan Reynolds here for Mint Mobile. You know, one of the perks about having 4 kids that you know about is actually getting a direct line to the big man up north. And this year, he wants you to know the best gift that you can give someone is the gift of Mint Mobile's unlimited wireless for $15 a month. Now, you don't even need to wrap it. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. Episode 103, General Kellermann, one of Napoleon's best cavalry leaders. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all of our listeners that if they'd like to support our podcast, please go to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon. If you'd like to support our podcast in other ways, please go to our YouTube channel and hit the subscribe button. As always, we appreciate your support. Now, on with the show. We have a fantastic guest back for, it's like half dozen time or fifth time? I don't know, Charles. What is it?
The 35th time, John.
It's a good arbitrary number. I like it. Yeah. We have the great Charles Mackay back on the line. For those of you who don't know Charles, he's a graduate of the Napoleonic Studies Institute there at Florida State. He's also a brilliant mind on the Peninsula War and General Junot in particular. And he recently was on an episode of Napoleonic Quarterly on the Egyptian Institute that was set up by Napoleon. And we're thrilled to have him. Hello, Charles.
Hey, John, how are you? Thanks for having me again. I appreciate it.
Yeah. What was that episode you did with our friends at Napoleonic Quarterly? Was it just about how Napoleon brought scholars along with him and set up the institute there in Cairo?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Sometimes in the stream of, heady events and world-changing events, we sometimes don't have too much of an opportunity to do some detours on some interesting and important topics. And Alex Stevenson, the host over there, asked me to do a segment on the Institute of Egypt, and I was happy to help him out for that one. So that's, Napoleon taking all the savants over and all the survey work they did and all the antiquities they cataloged and described and found. And I learned a lot in researching the episode, and hopefully some folks will get something out of that.
Yeah, indeed. And so check out Charles on Napoleonic Quarterly. And yeah, we're going to go ahead and dive into our subject matter today. So who are we talking about today, Charles?
We're talking about Francois Etienne Kellermann, the son of the savior at Valmy and the Marshal of France. His son had quite a prolific and storied career, both in the Revolution and during the Empire period.
All right, so I'm not going to call him Kellermann the Lesser. It's more Kellermann the Younger.
That'll work.
Or
for the purposes of this podcast, we can just call him Kellermann.
Kellermann, okay. Yeah, not the Marshal, the General.
Correct.
But yeah, he was born in Metz in August 1770 to a soon-to-be very famous father, also a talented cavalry general. I guess he had a military-style upbringing in his house. What was his young years like?
Yeah, he did. He comes from a royal or noble family, rather. So he was pegged at an early date for a career in the military. Mm-hmm. And his family also had some diplomatic service routes in the past. So, as you know, he's going to be sent as a diplomat to the United States early in his career as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. How did his military career begin?
Well, in 1791, he gets sent to the United States as a representative, of course, from France's new government. And the United States was one of the first to recognize the change in government in France. And of course, it was an important relationship for the United States during the War of Independence. And not much of note in terms of his diplomatic record in the United States, except that he does pick up and perfect his English. Okay. So not in addition to French, he spoke English which a little foreshadowing is going to come in real handy here in several years.
Okay, we'll come back to that point in a minute.
Indeed.
In 1793, Kellermann the Younger is back serving under his father,
Hmm.
but he was suspended from duty and arrested alongside his dad after the siege of Lyon. Do we know what happened there?
Yeah, this is the height of the terror, or it's getting to be the period of the terror, and of course the Kellermans with their noble backgrounds just became suspect in general, and so they were arrested, and through the efforts of some folks, uh, both Kellerman and his father were eventually freed and resumed military service.
Yeah, I remember that happening to a couple of marshals and generals. Just
Well, it happened to Napoleon, in fact.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
at some point or another, a lot of these guys come under suspicion, and again, most of this is trumped up stuff because you at that point you could not have asked for more of a Republican general than Napoleon,
hmm
and he got arrested. So this is just sort of de rigueur. It's just lucky that the Kellermans survived, where so many did not,
right, right.
like Josephine's husband, first
Yep,
husband.
yep. Um, well, in 1796, Kellerman is promoted to chef de brigade and serves under Napoleon for the first time. What famous battles is he involved in the Italian campaigns?
Yeah, so he's there from the start. So he is on all of the early battles. He was involved at the occupation of Milan. He was there and at Pavia, the one of the Italian towns that revolted against French occupation soon after in 1796. He's at Lodi. He's at all these early Italian campaigns, functioning as a cavalry officer.
Okay. Well, during the crossing of the Tagliamento in March 1797, Kellerman was wounded by several saber blows, but manages to push that crossing and get his troops across. And he's praised and promoted by Napoleon, and who raises him to general of brigade. What skills do you think Kellerman possessed that made him stand out? Because there's a lot of brave guys in the army of Italy.
Sure. I think what might distinguish Kellerman at this point is his tenacity. And when he pushes the river here, it's not looking good. His unit is surrounded and isolated. And rather than surrender, Kellerman just continued to fight. He did slay several enemy personally in this hand-to-hand combat and refused to leave or abandon the position, and that's what finally rallied the unit and rallied others in the area to help come to his support, and they won the crossing. But he is strong-willed and hard-headed and incredibly tenacious, which in some circumstances is going to pay off really well, like this. When he gets into an administrative role later, maybe not so much.
Not his strong suit. Yeah,
No,
yeah.
we'll see about that too.
Well, yeah, it's funny you mention that. Just to be tenacious can also be stubborn in another situation. So yeah,
Yes,
well,
yeah.
we'll get to that. We'll jump ahead though to the famous 1800 Battle of Marengo, where Napoleon's almost defeated by the Austrians. The famous General Desai gets a lot of the credit for saving the victory for Napoleon at the last minute, but do you think Kellerman should get more credit here?
Uh, well, Kellerman certainly thought he should have. So, setting up reminding your listeners, Marengo was fought in June of 1800. It's Napoleon's first major battle after assuming the role of first consul. So, winning this battle is critical. And Napoleon had crossed the Alps and then did not have a lot of great intelligence on where his enemy was. And so, sort of pancaked his army looking for the Austrians. And it turns out that the biggest collection of Austrians under Melas was at Alessandria. And rather uncharacteristically, Melas decided to attack Napoleon. And so the early stages of the battle, it's Victor is there with Laon and Murat, and the French are outnumbered and not doing well. In fact, they had been pressed so hard that by the end of the day, the French army is starting to stream off the battlefield in apparent defeat. Melas had received a minor wound, and so withdrew to the citadel there at Alessandria to kind of tend his wounds, and turned over the pursuit of the French to a subordinate. And then it was at that moment that General Desaix came hustling on to the battlefield, and famously assessing the situation when Napoleon said, essentially, this battle is lost, but there's still time to win another one. And then, even though the footsore division of Desaix had been basically trotting all day long to get to the battlefield, they, steeled themselves to go into battle. And the Austrians were not prepared for this. They were surprised, and at the perfectly timed moment, as the Austrian pursuit column is sort of shaken by this appearance of some French in good order who mean to attack them, they get hit on the flank by Kellermann's heavy cavalry, which had been on the field at the start of the day, had not played too much of a role up in the battle up until that point, but then hit 3 battalions of Austrian grenadiers on the flank, and destroyed all of them before they had an opportunity to form a square. And then when the Austrian cavalry hustled up to try and support its own grenadiers, they broke against Kellermann's cuirassiers and fled through their own infantry, causing just a complete collapse of the Austrian column. And then Napoleon achieved the decisive victory that he sought. It's important to the Napoleonic legend. Napoleon rewrote the official account of this 4 times.
Yeah.
And, it's awfully convenient. I mean, if you're looking at this cynically, that Desaix died historically, took a cannonball to the chest in the height of the counterattack. And Napoleon did recognize Kellermann at the time. But, as the years went on, Kellermann's apparent role, diminished, or at least in the official accounts. He's there, he's leading the cavalry, it's important.
Yeah.
But Napoleon claims more and more of the credit that this goes on.
Yeah.
And Kellermann was pretty sore at the time that he did not get any more credit for this than he thought he deserved, and was happy to let anyone who would listen know that he should have gotten more credit for that.
Well, he gets some credit. A month later, he's promoted to general of division. So he's basically as high as you can go without being a marshal. And whenever Kellermann's name was brought up later for his rampant looting of conquered territories, Napoleon would always remark, quote, "General, whenever your name is brought before me, I think of nothing but Marengo," end quote. Is this accurate? He kind of just turned a blind eye to it. I mean, it sounds like Napoleon really appreciated whatever he did. It's kind of like Augereau. He's like, he was at Castiglione with me, so I can forgive any sins that he commits from here on out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's entirely true. Napoleon never really regarded looting as a cardinal sin anyway. And of course, it's one of the most capable and able and systematic looters in the history of the planet. This is not a cardinal sin.
Right.
For over 50 years, Burlington's legacy has been great deals on coats for all weather conditions. So before you're caught unprepared for the winter weather, head to Burlington for name brands, quality items, and surprising fits for every family member. Stock up on coats, sweaters, and accessories before the cold hits, so you can finally stop avoiding the elements and start living comfortably. Warm up at your nearest Burlington location less than 1 mile away. Burlington. Deals, brands, wow.
This episode is brought to you by United Airlines. When you want to make the most of your vacation, book with United. They're an airline that cares about your travels as much as you do. United is transforming the flying experience with Bluetooth connectivity, screens, power at every seat, and bigger overhead bins to help fit everyone's bag. And with their app, you can skip the bag check line, get live updates, and more. Change the way you fly. Book your next trip today at united.com.
Kellermann again distinguishes himself at the famous Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, where he's wounded yet again. In 1806, he serves in the cavalry of the Army of the Reserve. Then in 1807, he commands the cavalry during Junot's invasion of Portugal. Mm-hmm. Can you walk us through that invasion? I know it was quite difficult for the French.
Sure. They leave France in October, and so march through France, Spain, and Portugal in October and November. The weather was atrocious.
Mm.
And, Napoleon, looking at maps in Paris, thought that the quicker route would be for them to drop down to the Tagus and then go straight to the west. But there were no roads there then, and there are virtually no roads there now. And so the army suffered quite a bit on this march. In fact, when Junot occupies Lisbon on 30 November of 1807, he doesn't have any cavalry. It
Mhm.
took the cavalry a full week for them to straggle in from the intensity of this march. So
Yeah,
it was not a happy. This was not a march of roses or anything like that.
yeah, it's interesting you say the maps, but I mean the maps were not like maps we have today. They were probably poorly laid out. And for Napoleon to look at a map in Paris and say, well, the quickest way between 2 points is a straight line, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's supplies or roads or, like you were saying, anything easy between that straight line to get to Lisbon. He probably
Right.
should have followed the roads, even if it wasn't a straight line to get there.
Yeah, Napoleon had just complete contempt, though, for the Spanish and the Portuguese at the start, in the middle, at the end.
Yeah.
And so probably didn't certainly underplayed the hardships that Junot's corps experienced marching, although at the same time cautiously aware that he didn't want to get in a long protracted siege for the fortresses that covered the traditional approaches to Lisbon from Spain. So yeah, it was not a fun time.
Well, Junot's there for a while, but he famously suffers defeat to the future Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Amero. And Kellermann is within Junot's army, and he handles kind of the diplomatic negotiations in the infamous Convention of Sintra. Can you tell us what happened here? Because it's still today one of the most maligned peace treaties I think Britain and France have ever signed. But can you walk us through what happens in this?
Yeah, maligned perhaps, but not by the French.
Yeah.
So, and let me just mention briefly at the Battle of Valmiera, where Junot gets defeated decisively by Wellesley. Kellermann again performed very well. He was Junot's only reserve was about 2,100 or so converged grenadiers he'd pulled from the various units. And when the central attack was failing, Junot ordered Kellermann at the head of these grenadiers to try and support the French position. And in fact, Kellermann at the head of these grenadiers made more progress than any of the other French units. Now they were, you know, they were sent down the hill packing by accurate counterfire from the British regiments fighting against them. And Kellermann was again wounded.
Mm.
But Kellermann also then put himself at the head of the cavalry to cover the retreat of the army. So again, performing very well as a military man, but we also see his value here as a diplomat because after a council of war where Junot and his officers kind of considered what their options were, they were aware, for instance, that the Battle of Bailén had happened, which was in July the previous month, where Dupont had been caught and surrendered an entire French corps to the Spanish. So Junot knew that the French in Lisbon were completely isolated. So their options of a fighting withdrawal looked pretty grim. And so they decided, all right, so let's see what kind of terms we can get from the British. So they sent Kellermann, of course, as the one who had some diplomatic experience, to go treat with the British to see what they could get. And the British command situation had changed. Wellesley knew that he was going to be superseded, in fact, twice by General Berard and then Hugh Dalrymple. And so at the start of the conversation, it was Wellesley, Berard, and Dalrymple for the British. And
And
at
they're
this
speaking
point,
in French, right? Because that's the diplomatic language.
right, of course, that they greeted each other and spoke in French and carried on the conversation that way. But then when it came time for the British to consult with each other and talk about, is this acceptable? Is that acceptable? What we want to do? They went into an adjacent room. And the arguments there apparently were quite animated. And Wellesley, as you might imagine, uh, better had a better grip of the situation than Berard or Dalrymple, and was much less willing to be charitable to the French. But Berard and Dalrymple had never had any real field experience, and so I didn't know what the dispositions were and if the French are willing to offer an evacuation, which just happened in the 18th century on, many previous occasions. That was acceptable to him. But what Kellermann did not disclose, of course, was that Kellermann knew English. So he's hearing all of the conversations and the heated debates and things and such. And, he learns through that where Hugh Dalrymple's, sort of pressure points are. And so if the British came back and wanted some additional demands, then Kellermann could just play on the fears of Hugh Dalrymple, and ended up getting a fantastic deal for the French. And just summing it up, the French would be transported back on British ships with their arms and their standards and their eagles, and frankly even their loot. And they weren't even paroled. So literally, when the French army gets back, Napoleon sends them right back into the peninsula. And on the British side, of course, that the three of them get court-martialed.
Right.
And Berard and Dalrymple never see command again. And of course, we know Wellesley, obviously, very famously, saw all kinds of action and became the Duke of Wellington. That's one of those moments where, well, Kellermann has problems with ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you would consider that to be unethical to not disclose that you know English. I'm sure nobody ever asked him, so he didn't feel compelled to tell anybody. But
right. But I bet Dalrymple and Berard were probably mad at him for the rest of their days. Like that
sure,
guy.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you got to think that Kellermann is chuckling all the way back to the camp. And, even Napoleon, although displeased that the French had lost Portugal, didn't have any fault with Junot. Junot was sent right back into the field again. And how could you? I mean, you come back with everything.
Yeah. Well, after being repatriated to France, Kellermann, like you said, is soon back in Spain and wins a big victory over the Spanish army at the Battle of Alba de Tormes. And his greed and looting remain unchecked while in Spain, similar to other marshals and generals like Soult and Augereau. And we were talking kind of before the podcast recording, what, if any, was Napoleon's policy on looting? Because I know the age and the time, war should pay for itself. So, steal whatever you can to pay for or feed your army. But
sure,
there was other marshals, Serurier and I think Bernadotte, who didn't like to loot anything. It seems like there was
Suchet was not a big looter. Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed like there's two different fields of thought on this.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Let's just, put on the table that oftentimes, the tone for any organization is set by the leader at the top. So, when Napoleon is going through the first Italian campaign, and all of these great cities, Turin, Milan, Florence, Venice, all these great Rome, all these great cities fall to the French. Napoleon is not just sort of picking stuff up willy-nilly. He literally has experts that he chooses and sometimes commissions to go through all of the different museums or private collections, requisitioning art to go back to France. So a good chunk of the collection at the Louvre was built entirely by Napoleon and his systematic looting. I know that one of the guys that was in the Institute of Egypt, another place shamelessly looted, was sent to Portugal to help Junot and authorities there pick out all the things in the different palaces of Portugal to haul back to Paris. So looting was done on a systematic basis, and of course by the soldiers in the field on a less systematic basis. And I think Napoleon's general sense on this, if the looting is not causing, the local population enough discomfort that they revolt, then he just turns a blind eye. He just turns a blind eye to it.
Yeah.
And, guys like Kellermann and Massena and some others, you see this and like, okay, green light, take whatever you can.
Yeah.
So if the tradition in the past had been conqueror spoils to take what they can, they would. And Kellermann was a shameless looter. I think what distinguishes Kellermann, though, we're right at the period that we're talking about his presence in Spain in 1811.
Yeah.
And he's made a military governor, the district that includes Ciudad Rodrigo and the approaches to the northern part of Portugal. So when Napoleon orders Massena to command the army of Portugal in 1810, an army, incidentally, that Napoleon had intended on commanding himself, but because of his impending divorce to Josephine and subsequent marriage to Marie Louise, had to stay in Paris. So he sent his most trusted lieutenant, Massena, to command that army. So
Mm-hmm.
that part of Spain, the interior part of Spain, is bereft of resources of every kind.
Right.
And so siege warfare plays an important role in that, as you've covered. Gathering the supplies, munitions, food, fodder, is a major part of the management of that campaign.
Yeah.
And Kellermann is made a military governor of the area around Ciudad Rodrigo and Leon, and he's going to be at the core of gathering the resources necessary for the army of Portugal.
Yeah.
But when Napoleon adds a couple of districts to his responsibilities, Kellermann just kind of has a total power trip and issues an order that essentially everything that goes on in that area goes through him. And I mean, essentially, it was Messina is supposed to be the commander in the area,
Mm-hmm.
and Kellermann sets himself up as the kind of like a king,
Yeah.
and drags his feet on sending supplies. Massena has to order him specifically over and over and over again to send supplies. Requisitioning of money in the area was also a challenge, but Kellermann, kind of like tax farming of old, the ancien regime, he's keeping a lot of those resources for himself, a lot of that money for himself. Kind of where that obstinance that I had foreshadowed at Tagliamento comes in here, and he's just obstinate and stubborn. And
Well, and a lot of the marshals in the peninsula were not team players. They would steal, supplies from each other at some points, just to feed their own men.
and gosh, you got to have a little heart for Massena in this. His three corps commanders are Ney, Junot, and Ryle. I mean, three of the hottest heads in the army. So Kellermann did not acquit himself with honor and glory here.
Okay. Well, in May 1811, he finally returns to France, and he actually misses the Russian invasion because he was on sick leave. So this is probably a good thing for Kellerman that he didn't have to go through that.
You'd have to think.
Yeah.
I should note that date of May 1811 is pretty important. That's right after Fuentes de Nero, where Napoleon has recalled Massena. He does a total house cleaning, and a lot of those guys are reassigned. That's when
Yeah.
Marmont comes down. And Kellermann was one of the ones that was reassigned. And frankly, probably not reassigned in a positive light.
Right. Kellerman's health never fully recovers, but he's back in action during the 1813 campaign and fights at the Battle of Bautzen and again at Dresden and Leipzig. He also fought during the 1814 invasion of France. How does he perform in these? Do you know?
Yeah, he performs very well, and I think here you can see the distinction between maybe not a great administrator, definitely not a great administrator, but a really superior cavalry commander. And he fights with elan and tenacity and spirit and conviction, both in 1813 and in 1814. He
And
did very well in these.
And I think that's important because there was a lot of so-called droopy plumed marshals who thought, oh, everything's over, we're done. And to fight with spirit at that time was, I'm not going to say rare, but it stood out.
Yeah, he was definitely one of the more energetic generals continuing to fight.
Okay. Well, Napoleon abdicates in April 1814 and he submits to the returning Bourbons under Louis XVIII. But interestingly, he flocks to Napoleon's banner after Napoleon escapes from Elba and retook the throne. But his dad, Marshal Kellermann, does not. So there's like a little family drama here, don't you think?
Yeah, although it did not seem to impact the relationship between the two. The Marshal carries on till 1820.
Yeah.
And Kellermann, of course, the subject of our discussion today, lasts until 1835. And, Kellerman is still active. He's still old enough to serve in the military. And, everything that Kellerman was at this point was not because of the noble name his father had given him, but because of what he had earned on his own during, fighting for the emperor.
Yeah.
So I think there was some loyalty there, and a recognition of all that he had was the exploits during the First Empire, and he would rather go down with that ship than attach himself to the Bourbons.
Right. Well, let's discuss Kellerman the Younger's role at the stalemate Battle of Quatre Bras. And yeah, I'm going to call it that. Kellerman almost won this battle single-handedly, correct?
Well, he did. Again, he's in the right place at the right time. He happens to command the cavalry here at Quatre Bras. And so once the initial British forces are pushed away, it's Kellerman's job to charge the remaining defenders. Now, he did not break any Allied squares, but he did manage to catch several units before they had time to form square, scattering them effectively. And for a brief moment, held that super important crossroads right there. Quatre Bras, meaning, of course, four arms. That's the intersection where four roads met. It was a strategically critically important area. It was the objective Napoleon had hoped Ney would take.
Right.
And for a brief moment, Kellerman and his cav are there holding on to the crossroads. But he looks behind him and there's no infantry. And, as we both know, cavalry cannot hold a position for long without infantry support. So
Right.
had to retire at the sight of the approaching British infantry.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think Marshal Ney assigned him. He's like, look, I've been assaulting this position for hours. Nothing's happening. Can you just throw your troops in there and see what happens? And I think even Kellerman was like, okay, we'll give it a shot. And then it worked.
Yep.
And Ney was like, oh my God, I need to support him. But it was too late by that point.
Yeah. And again, Kellerman covers himself in glory for 10 minutes there by holding the crossroads. But not under the eye of Napoleon. Again, Kellerman, a lot of these guys have some bad luck in that they do really well for the empire, but rarely, like after Italy, are they ever, in direct sight of the emperor.
Right.
And so Kellerman performs very well, but, didn't get the job done.
No. And, 2 days later, I think, is Waterloo. How does he do there?
So he's involved in the main charges up the center with La Haye Saint that Ney had ordered later in the day. And again, they fail to break any British squares. The British are the most disciplined of the infantry units that the French would ever face in terms of forming square. And so, they ultimately do very little damage to the British center there with these repeated charges. But, he did what he's asked to do, and then, helps to cover the retreat as the army falls apart afterwards. So not as much glory here on the battlefield, although he's in the thick of the action again.
Well, obviously Napoleon abdicates again, and during the Second Restoration, the Bourbons basically put him in disgrace, but he's eventually forgiven. What were his later years like?
His later years were pretty quiet, actually. He was, in fact, disgraced, but like many of the former Napoleonic marshals around 1820, 1821 or so, he's returned to good graces. He's made again a peer of France, and he lives out the rest of his days in retirement.
Okay. Well, as you mentioned, he dies in 1835 in June. What do you think his legacy is?
For historians, I think he represents a lot of the most striking aspects of this period. That he's a dashing cavalry officer. He covers himself in glory, both through personal exploits and bravery, and in many ways, he's a model of a fantastic cavalry officer. But then he also kind of highlights the limits of technology and Napoleonic organization, there are limits to what these guys are able to accomplish. And then the absence of the emperor, especially in like places like the peninsula, it's just a hot mess, and
Yeah.
it is not efficient, and the French machine does not function well without the emperor around. And then you layer on top of that the sort of shameless looting carried out by Kellermann and others. Uh, it highlights a lot of dichotomies, a lot of contradictions.
Mm.
Coming out of a revolution where you had so many social changes and things, and it engendered so much loyalty, enough so that Kellermann rallies to the cause in 1815. It's just such a collection of contradictions, which ultimately is what makes these guys fascinating, right?
Right.
How did he maintain this cognitive dissonance in his brain, or does he compartmentalize and go into denial? It's one of the reasons I'm endlessly fascinated.
I think it's interesting because his dad, after Valmy, 1792-93, was probably the most famous man in France. So
Sure.
you're always fighting that legacy. Like, all right, well, how do I make my own spot on this famous era? Like my dad is. It's kind of like being the son of a famous athlete. Like, how do I outshine my dad and rest on my own merits and laurels? And I think Kellermann did pretty well to do that.
Yeah, I think there was some torch passing there. The Marshal did not have much of a career after into the consul. Once the
Yep.
consulate kind of came,
Yep.
Kellerman was allowed to, exit stage right,
Mhm.
obviously clearing the path for his own son. And so I think there was a convenient passing of the torch, and then moving from the Republican France to the Empire France was another, definitive break. The Marshal
Mhm.
doesn't have a role in Napoleonic France, whereas the son does.
Yeah.
So, Kellerman, the Marshal, had his moment during the Revolution, and now Kellerman, the son, will have his moment during the Empire.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting man. So thank you for
It,
that.
it would be interesting if the age bands had been a little different, if the Kellerman, the Marshal, had been a little bit younger, and still would have had a career, say into Austerlitz, or maybe even up to 1807.
Yeah.
What would we be saying about his son in terms of the overlap there, or the legacy, or trying to outshine the father, so to speak? But the timing works out perfectly for Francois Etienne.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you for that, Charles. Always a pleasure having you on the show. And again, if you want to learn more about Charles or find him, he's a Bubbles Vampire on Twitter. I highly recommend his Twitter page because he posts a lot of really interesting Napoleonic history there and some great threads as well. So check him out on Twitter. And it's good to have you on the show again, my friend.
Thanks, I appreciate it, John. Thanks for inviting me anytime.